Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Marielle Villeray, and I'm the Program Development Director for Academic Initiatives and Strategic Innovation at the CUNY Graduate Center. The Graduate Center is the postgraduate degree conferring institute within the City University of New York system, and our campus is located in Midtown Manhattan. I'm happy to welcome you to the Fridays at 1 speaker series, which is organized by members of one of our Vanguard non-degree programs, LP Squared, a lifelong peer learning program. LP Squared is a peer learning community in which admitted members teach and learn from each other without exams or grades. Members also contribute to the program's organizing efforts, including an advisory board, committees, and member activities, including the art exhibit of member work currently on display on the first floor of the Graduate Center. If you are interested in learning more and are retired or semi-retired looking to apply, please visit www.gc.cuny.edu/LP2. I'll now hand the virtual mic over to LP Squared member Ken Witty to introduce today's guest and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marielle. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Vladeck to Fridays at 1. Stephen Vladeck holds the Charles Alan Wright Chair in Federal Courts at the University of Texas School of Law in Austin. He's a nationally recognized expert on the federal courts and constitutional law. He's argued over a dozen cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court, and various other lower courts. He's CNN's Supreme Court analyst and editor and author of One First, a popular weekly newsletter about the Supreme Court. The Secret Docket, which we're about to discuss, has been on the New York Times bestseller list. And everyone, before we start, if you have a question, please enter it into the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Steve. Let's start by explaining exactly what the Secret Docket is.
So the Shadow Docket is a term that was coined in 2015 by a Chicago law professor named Will Bode. And what Will meant by the term was basically to capture a large chunk of what the U.S. Supreme Court does that really is not part of our typical discourse about the Supreme Court. Usually when we talk about rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court, we're focused on what, for lack of a better term, we might call the merits docket. That is to say, the 60-ish cases that the Supreme Court takes up each year, where there are multiple rounds of briefing, there's oral argument, and the case is decided through some lengthy set of written opinions, often in the spring, May or June, cases like Dobbs with regard to abortions, or Bruin for guns, or the affirmative action cases from this June. And, Will's insight was that there's actually quite a lot of important stuff that the Supreme Court does away from the merits docket through orders that are by tradition unsigned, so we don't know who wrote them or what the vote count is usually, that by tradition are unexplained, so we don't even know why the court did what it did, but that can often have really, really significant real-world impact. And so the sort of the point of the book was to introduce readers to this phenomenon and to really try to provide a more comprehensive, holistic introduction to what the Supreme Court actually does, so that we'd be in a better position to understand what is so unique and, to my mind, uniquely problematic about what the current Supreme Court is doing. So that's the sort of the etymology and purpose of the term.
So how much of the Supreme Court rulings are done through the Shadow Docket?
So, I mean, by volume, it's north of 99%. So, the Supreme Court, the Shadow Docket, there are really a bunch of things on the Shadow Docket, but the two most common types of things that the Supreme Court does through an unsigned, unexplained order, one is the decision whether to grant or deny what's called certiorari, an appeal. So basically, whether to take up a case and put it on the merits docket in the first place is all done behind the scenes through this very sort of obscure and inaccessible process. And that's probably, 97% of the court's work any year is figuring out which cases to hear and which cases not to hear. And those decisions can often be pretty momentous on their own. And then in the last couple of years, we've seen a real uptick in another type of order, which is with regard to what's known as an emergency application. So if you think about the typical case going to the Supreme Court, it takes years, 3 years, 4 years, 6 years to get all the way from the lowest level courts in the state or federal court system to the US Supreme Court. And a lot of times the parties are fighting over what should the rules be while the case is working its way through the court system. So for example, if a plaintiff is able to get a federal judge to block a federal policy on a nationwide basis, the federal government might say, well, we want the policy to be in effect, even as we are appealing this decision that purports to block it. And so can those kinds of emergency applications, basically these sort of early preliminary interim rulings from the Supreme Court, have become much more prolific and much more frequent in the last 6 or 7 years, so that now, it's still about 1% of the court's docket, but these are now cases with massive impact. Everything from, whether there will be access to mifepristone, one of the drugs used in the most common abortion procedure, on a national basis, whether, New York will be allowed to carry out certain COVID mitigation policies, whether President Biden will be allowed to carry out certain immigration policies. I mean, you name it. And this is now, sort of fodder for the Supreme Court through unsigned, unexplained orders.
So how did it used to be? I know it's changed. Let's just go back a little bit in terms of history, and how was the shadow docket used through history of the Supreme Court? Why don't we start there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and indeed, the book. I mean, one of the things one of my favorite parts about writing the book was actually getting to retrace some of this history. So, chapter 1 of the book is really very much a history of the evolution of the Supreme Court's docket, which may not sound like the most exciting chapter in the history of the world, but I had fun writing it. So, the Supreme Court of the first, say, 100 years of the Republic looked very different from today's Supreme Court. The justices had no control over their docket, meaning that they had to hear every single case that they had the power to hear. Right? Congress basically controlled the court's docket, not the justices. And into the 20th century, even as Congress started to give the justices some control over their docket, the way that the court used to handle emergency applications is that the full court wouldn't handle them at all. Right, all the way until 1980, the norm was for an emergency application to be resolved by one justice, by whichever justice had geographic responsibility for a particular part of the country. So, Justice Sotomayor is the circuit justice for the Second Circuit. That's the federal appeals court that covers New York, Connecticut, and Vermont. And so in the old days, if there was an emergency application in a case out of New York, the parties would just go to Justice Sotomayor and argue maybe before her in chambers. She might write an opinion on her own, but the norm was to have those matters resolved with as much process as possible. So oral argument before a single justice, an opinion if possible, but also in a context in which no one would confuse what one justice had done with a decision of the full court. So to minimize any broader impact from this emergency ruling. And that practice really dies in the late 1970s and early 1980s as the court is besieged with a flood of last-minute emergency applications in death penalty cases, where, because of the way that the court sort of shifts its death penalty jurisprudence, there are now a number of 11th hour claims from death row prisoners that their execution should be frozen while they litigate some particular challenge to their conviction or sentence. And so just one data point to help drive this home. In 1960, the full Supreme Court received a total of 4 emergency applications relating to death sentences. In 1983, it received 83. And so with that, there comes pressure on the court to change its behavior. So that starting in the early 1980s, the court, one, starts having the entire court deal with any remotely contentious emergency application, so that now it's going to be the full court instead of just the local circuit justice. But two, Ken, because it's the full court, the norm of having oral argument and of writing an opinion goes away, so that we start this practice of having emergency applications resolved through one sentence, two sentence orders, without any explanation, without any oral argument, without any real opportunity to be heard. And I think, Ken, the reason why that stays sort of mostly hidden for the better part of 45 years is because, or 40 years, because within the death penalty context, it was over there, where unless you were a death penalty lawyer, you probably weren't really grappling with this on a day-to-day basis. The last shift, what gets us to our present moment, is when, starting in the mid-2010s, the court starts applying the same norms to emergency applications that have much broader impacts. President Obama's Clean Power Plan, President Trump's travel ban. I mean, you name it. Now the court's applying the same don't explain anything mentality to orders that are really massive in their real world effects. Sorry, I went on for too long.
No, not at all. We have a lot to learn on this subject. So first of all, why in 83 suddenly did it change from just one Supreme Court judge to the whole court, and why did the whole normal process stop?
So, I mean, I think the sort of we don't know the answer to your first question. The court never even really acknowledged that it was changing its procedures. It just did it. And this is actually one of the phenomena that you really start to encounter when you spend more time with the Supreme Court. The court is driven, not exclusively, but in most important ways by norms, not by rules. And very few of those norms are actually written down anywhere. But so the best version of this I've ever heard is that when the court realized in the late 1970s that these death penalty cases were coming, and it was pretty visible by 78 or 79 that they were coming, the concern was that, as opposed to the sort of the status quo, which had been to trust individual justices to act as proxies for the full court, the concern was that the death penalty was such a divisive topic, and the justices themselves were so bitterly divided over its basic constitutionality, that it would be really awkward if you had emergency applications in death penalty cases going to, say, Justice Brennan on the one hand, who was, very vehemently anti-death penalty, versus, say, a Justice White on the other hand, who was much more sympathetic to capital punishment. And so I think part of why it happens, Ken, is because there was concern about sort of the discordance between individual justices and the potential specter of sort of the justices' views on the death penalty, right, becoming the driving force in which applications went where. As for why did the court sort of not keep doing what it had, I mean, so again, this is what's weird. Before 1980, there was never a norm of having full court oral arguments on emergency applications. There was never a norm of having the full court write an opinion on emergency applications because it just wasn't something the full court would do much at all, right? And so when they shift from having an individual justice deal with this kind of application to the full court, the change would have been to start holding oral arguments and to start writing opinions. And I think in that moment, it didn't feel to the justices like this was that big of a shift in their behavior, especially, again, because it was cabined to the context of the death penalty. Say what you will about the death penalty, those cases tend not to have statewide or nationwide impact. Those cases tend to be very fact-bound about whether prisoner Smith, did or did not get a fair trial, right? Or whether something about his sentence was, not above board. Those kinds of orders can, right? The notion that the court shouldn't have to write 20 pages might have sat better with the court in 1980 than the idea that the court doesn't have to explain itself today before allowing, say, an entire state to use a congressional map that lower courts had blocked for violating the Voting Rights Act.
But you write in your book that it was around 2016 or 17 that the use of the shadow docket changed radically. So tell us about that, and how did it happen? Why did it happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's both a supply and a demand story here. So I think there were little snippets of the court's behavior shifting even during the Obama administration. I briefly mentioned the Clean Power Plan. This is, a really important Obama era rule that the court blocked 5-4 in an unsigned, unexplained order right before Justice Scalia's death in 2016. But what really shifts, what really makes all of this behavior visible is an absolute flurry of emergency applications filed in the Supreme Court by the Trump administration. So just a data point I think will help put this into context. From 2001 to 2017, so the George W. Bush presidency and the Obama presidency, two very different two-term presidencies, you had the federal government, the most frequent party in the Supreme Court, the most privileged party in the Supreme Court. You had the federal government go to the Supreme Court for emergency relief a total of 8 times. That's 8 times in 16 years. I'm not good at math, but I think I can do that. That's like once every other year. The Trump administration, in contrast, goes to the court 41 times in 4 years. And what's really remarkable about that number is it meant that we had, Ken, for the first time, a real body of cases where we could start to see some patterns emerge. And so when the Trump administration starts bringing all of these emergency applications to the court, we see the court behaving in ways that had never really been visible before when it comes to, not explaining what it was doing, granting relief in cases where it didn't look like the traditional rules would have supported relief, and all other kinds of sort of strategic and tactical behavior that the longer it went on, the less legally principled it looked, and the more it started to look like it was almost overtly partisan.
So, why did this conservative majority issue so many important decisions by the secret docket?
So, I mean, it's hard to get in their heads. I think at first it was not necessarily willful, right? In the sense that I think that there's a story you can tell about how, at least in 2017 and maybe even 2018 and to a lesser degree 2019, the justices are just reacting. They're not sitting back saying, oh, let's use emergency applications in this novel way. Rather, they're just reacting sort of one-off and one-off and one-off, and never taking the time to realize what their behavior in the aggregate is looking like. But, by the time we get to 2020, where because of COVID, there's now a real sort of huge uptick in emergency applications from multiple different vectors, and with every possible, partisan political configuration you can think of. By that point, it starts to look willful, because that's the point when we start to see the court deciding things through emergency applications while they had the chance to also decide them on the merits docket. So one really good example, one of the common objections to COVID mitigation measures, especially in blue states like California and New York, was that they were infringing upon religious liberty, that they were basically interfering with religious practice without adequate justification. And the court issues a series of orders through the shadow docket in the winter of 2020 and early 2021, blocking New York and California measures. Finally, in April of 2021, in one of the California cases, the court even goes so far as to write a very short opinion in which it articulates a new understanding of the free exercise clause to explain why California's rule was unconstitutional. What is so striking about that decision in April 2021, it's called Tandon versus Newsom, is that when the Supreme Court chose to decide that case that way, the justices were already sitting on a case that they had heard oral argument in the previous November, raising a very similar question about the free exercise clause. So I guess the long-winded answer to your question is, I think at first it was not willful. I think at first it was just reactive and defensive, where the justices were hit with this flood of applications and they didn't sort of think through the consequences of how they were reacting to them. But by early 2021, the court is choosing to use emergency applications in contexts in which they could just as well have, gone through the full regular process to decide these issues. And that's the point at which I think the court's behavior crossed the line, in my view, from problematic to actually like seriously institutionally harmful. That's, I think that's really where the criticism in the book starts to sort of reach, I guess, full throttle, I guess is the best way to put it.
Let's go back a little bit, back to 2017, when it was the Trump administration that was bringing all these emergency issues to the court, right? You said they were being reactive. Wasn't there just an enormous number of these cases coming to the, well, like, for instance, everything to do with the immigration policy of Trump?
Tell us. Yeah, depending upon, where you sit, right, there are different ways of looking at the causes of the uptick in applications in 2017. One common view is that lower courts were being overly aggressive and pushing back against President Trump's policies, and that the Supreme Court had to step in to set him straight. One argument is that lower courts were too often using a novel type of relief called a nationwide injunction, and so the Supreme Court had to sort of push back against those. Ken, what is so, to me, I think, revealing, right, about those defenses, basically those suggestions that the court's hand was forced, is the contrast between how the court reacts to the Trump era immigration cases and how the court reacts 4 years later to Biden era immigration cases, where, in the Trump cases, we saw the same pattern over and over again. A lower court would block a Trump immigration policy, the travel ban, the public charge rule, the border wall, the third country asylum rule. You name it. The Supreme Court would stay that injunction, so allow the policy to go back into effect with no explanation. And then the case, Ken, would never get back to the court on the merits. Either the administration would change the policy, or by the time the case got back to the Supreme Court, it was now the Biden administration, and so the policy had gone away. Fast forward to the Biden administration. So there are two major early Biden immigration cases where the same pattern, at least at the beginning, repeats, where lower courts now in Texas, as opposed to California or Hawaii or New York, lower courts in Texas now issue nationwide injunctions against Biden immigration policies. The Supreme Court this time refuses to stay those injunctions. And Ken, when those cases actually do come back to the court on the merits, and now the court actually sides with the Biden administration. What is so remarkable about that is it suggests that any of the neutral explanations we could have offered for why the court had been so aggressive during the Trump administration don't hold up. Right? If it was hostility to nationwide injunctions, that hostility should also have been present in the Biden cases. If it was deference to the president in the unique context of immigration policy, where historically courts have accorded a fair amount of deference to the executive, that too should have held up during the Biden administration. If it were just, we like Trump's policies and we don't like Biden's policies, we would have expected the court, right, to uphold Trump's policies, which with one exception it never did, and to strike down Biden's policies, which it didn't, right? And so the problem is that, like, as you get more and more cases, as the data sets become more complete, all of the neutral defenses, all of the analytical justifications for why the court was intervening in these cases but not those cases fall apart. And we're left with the very real, at least appearance, that what's happening in these cases is the justices just voting their preferences, versus when the time comes and they actually have to write an opinion, it gets harder to do that, and they actually have to act more like judges.
So let's go back, let's go on to 2020, where you say it's not just problematic, but, you know, something institutionally has really changed. Let's talk about the Alabama redistricting case in 2020, and others about elections. And tell me about that.
Sure. I mean, so the book sort of builds toward the election cases, because I think the election cases are perhaps the best, or depending on where you sit, the worst example of just how partisan the court's behavior at least looks. And so there are really a flurry of election-related cases in 2020 because a lot of states, are changing, or are at least asked to change some of their voting procedures because of COVID, to make it easier to vote from home or by mail, or through a drive-through voting place, what have you. And there's a pattern in those cases where the court intervenes in favor of whichever position tends to benefit the Republican Party, and then doesn't intervene when it would have benefited Democrats. So there's a massively important Florida felon disenfranchisement case in July of 2020 where the court didn't intervene, even though if you looked at its pattern of behavior in other cases, it should have. But you mentioned, the Alabama redistricting case, I think, is perhaps the best example of this phenomenon. It comes a little bit later, right? So the Alabama is about the 2020 census, but actually the 2022 elections. So after the 2020 census, Alabama, which has 7 congressional districts, redraws its map, and it redraws its map to create only one so-called majority-minority district, basically one district out of 7 in which a majority of the voters are Black, even though in Alabama, the population is 27% Black, right? So and given the sort of the geographical compactness of Black Alabamians, right, that actually really should have been 2 seats, not 1. Challengers sue, right? And so 2 different lower courts hold that Alabama's map violates the Voting Rights Act because it doesn't create a second majority-minority district, notwithstanding Alabama's population. Those decisions, right, should have required Alabama to either draw for itself or have the court draw a map with a second majority-minority district. But the Supreme Court steps in. So in February 2022, in an unsigned, unexplained order, the court votes 5-4 to freeze those lower court rulings and basically to allow Alabama to use its map with the only one majority-minority district in the 2022 midterm cycle. Now, this might seem like, well, okay, that's one state, it's one seat. Turns out, right, that decision has huge downstream consequences. The Supreme Court does the same thing a couple months later in Louisiana. So that's a second majority-minority district that the court says you don't have to have for this election cycle. And then there are lower court decisions in South Carolina, Georgia, and Ohio, right? 5 now, that say, we think there's the same problem, but the Supreme Court has said you don't have to do it this cycle. Ken, that's 5 seats in the House of Representatives that should have been majority-minority districts, and that instead were all safe Republican seats. Now, it's a bit, right, so right. It's a bit of an assumption that a majority-minority district would be a Democratic seat, but it's not that much of an assumption in these states. And so right there, you have the Supreme Court, through an unsigned, unexplained order, flipping 5 seats in the House of Representatives. That's the margin of Republican control in the House right now, right? Now, the best defense, again, the best defense of all of this would be, hey, you know what? The justices were convinced that Alabama's map was legal. They were convinced that the lower courts were wrong. And so why should they have to wait, right, a year and a half to say that? Well, Ken, as you know, right, when the court finally decided the Alabama case on the merits this June, it ruled 5-4 that the lower courts were right and that Alabama did have to redraw its map. And so this is, this to me is really driving home how these unsigned, unexplained orders have such massive impact. Because in a case in which the court ultimately sided with the challengers, the justices nevertheless let Alabama use an unlawful map in the 2022 midterm cycle in a way that affected perhaps not just 5 seats in the House, but which party controls the House, which, given where we are right now, is a rather significant development.
You also in the book give the example in Wisconsin, too. You want to tell us about that?
So another example of sort of the court intervening in a context that looked partisan was in Wisconsin, where, again, you had a similar debate about redistricting after the 2020 census. This time around, right, the court actually stepped in much earlier than it usually would, basically to tell the Wisconsin Supreme Court that it had to let the legislature draw a map instead of the state. The details are in chapter 6. I mean, I don't mean to get lost in the details. The point is that, the court really, historically, right, the Supreme Court has been quite clear that its legitimacy, Ken, comes from its ability to provide principled justifications for its decision making. Ken, not because you and I are going to agree with the principles that the justices are espousing, but hopefully at least because we're going to agree that they are principles. And part of the problem is that when you have the court deciding so much while saying so little, it starts to look unprincipled. You don't have to believe that the justices are acting in bad faith to still think that the appearance is that the court is acting in ways that are furthering the justices' individual partisan policy preferences as opposed to broader through lines about the law.
Yeah, and then, you point up the whole question about the Texas abortion ban in 2021. This is another example of no principles involved, just preferences.
So, the Texas abortion case is messy because the procedural piece of it was so complicated. But I think it was really that case that put the shadow docket on a lot of people's radar for the first time. So this was in September 2021. Texas passed, this is 10 months before Dobbs, before the Supreme Court overrules Roe. Texas had passed one of the most restrictive anti-abortion laws in the country, a near total ban on abortion after the 6th week of pregnancy. Many people don't even know they're pregnant by the 6th week. And the challengers had sought to prevent that law from going into effect. So if it went into effect, providers in Texas would basically have to stop offering abortion services. And the Supreme Court issued this very, very cryptic order in which they explained why they were going to allow the law to go into effect, and in which they blamed a series of messy procedural questions about the case. But Ken, there were 4 dissents, and 3 of the dissents were perhaps not surprisingly from the 3 Democratic appointees, including one from Justice Elena Kagan, who called out the court specifically for its use of what she called shadow docket decision-making, which in her words, every day becomes more unreasoned, unprincipled, and impossible to defend. But actually, I think the most interesting dissent was Chief Justice Roberts, who's no fan of abortion rights, but who really thought that it was incumbent upon the court to step in and preserve the status quo, preserve access to abortion in Texas while these novel procedural questions were hashed out. And I think what is so jarring about the court's non-intervention in the Texas case is that, Ken, as we've been discussing, the court had just spent the previous 10 months intervening more than it ever had before in very similar looking contexts to block state laws in blue states, in New York and California, New Jersey and Colorado, where in those cases, the claim was that these laws were infringing upon a novel conception of religious liberty. Now you have a state law directly infringing upon a 50-year-old constitutional right, and the justices sat on their hands. And that's where the charge of inconsistency, I think, is at its strongest, because now it looks like the justices are picking and choosing their interventions, not based on the strength of the underlying right, but rather based on how much they are personally interested in protecting that right. And that's really not historically how the court has, I think, quite rightly understood its role to be.
You've written that the shadow docket rulings fail to provide adequate guidance to lower courts and government actors. Is that a big problem?
I mean, I think so. So suppose that you are the governor of California and you're trying to figure out what you can and cannot do in the context of trying to take public health and public safety measures, to mitigate the spread of COVID. And you've had now 2 or 3 cases where the Supreme Court has blocked different attempts without telling you what was wrong with them. Pretty hard to know, right, in the next case, what you're supposed to do, right? Even if we start from the baseline that, like, your goal is to, have a policy that will be upheld by the courts. Ditto lower courts, right? Ken, you are a faithful district court or court of appeals judge who's trying to figure out what the right answer is. And all you know from the Supreme Court is that in a case that looked kind of similar, but maybe kind of different, they blocked the lower court decision, but didn't explain why. A good example of this is the ongoing litigation over mifepristone. So in April of this year, right, a federal judge in Amarillo, Texas, issued a nationwide injunction that would have effectively revoked the FDA's approval of mifepristone. The Supreme Court blocked that ruling, basically preserving nationwide access to mifepristone, but didn't say why it was blocking that ruling. And so because the Supreme Court didn't explain itself, the Court of Appeals, once it actually got the full appeal on the merits, nevertheless affirmed the district court's decision, agreed with the district court, because they had no instructions from the Supreme Court about what was wrong with the lower court decision. It's, that lack of guidance, I think, has both sort of broader problems for the court's legitimacy, but more specific problems for what government actors and lower courts are supposed to do in the next set of cases.
So you brought up the whole issue of partisanship. Has the court become a partisan institution?
I mean, I think it's, the court has always been a political institution. I think we've been lucky for most of the court's history that its politics did not align perfectly with the party structure of the day. I mean, only since 2010, only since Justice Kagan's appointment, have we had the current state where, where the justices are on the ideological spectrum is perfectly tied, right? Is one-to-one related to the party of the president who appointed them. That had never been true before 2010. We had, liberal Republicans, we had conservative Democrats. And so I think the problem is twofold, Ken. One, the court looks more partisan. And 2, the court regularly behaves in ways that seem describable only by reference to partisan policy preferences, as opposed to overarching coherent legal principles. And to me, Ken, it's those 2 things together that really amplify the charge that the contemporary court is at least appearing to behave in ways that are more partisan than we've seen at prior points in American history.
So you write in the book that the Supreme Court has become increasingly isolated from the public over the past decade. And I looked at some of the latest polls. So the latest polls show a severe drop in public support for the Supreme Court. Only 41% of Americans approve of the court's handling of its job. Only 23% of Democrats, 40% of independents, while 56% of Republicans approve. And you wrote, the court might even be said to see the public less as its audience than its enemy. Tell us about this.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time, not that long ago, right? Where the court actually thought that it was not just part of the way things work, but actually appropriate for the justices to be subject to at least some kind of, popular public criticism, right? The notion that actually part of the court's job, right, was to, not follow the election returns as the old line goes, but at least be somewhat in line with public opinion. And I think we've seen a real shift in at least some of the justices' views on this point in the last couple of years, where now, you get things like Justice Alito, in a quote to the Wall Street Journal this July, saying that he doesn't think Congress has the power to regulate the court at all. Alito's been very critical of people like me. I mean, he's called me out by name for criticizing the court because those criticisms, he says, are efforts to delegitimize the court. Chief Justice Roberts, right, said he wouldn't testify at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing because it would raise questions about separation of powers and judicial independence. There's like this increasingly of evolving mindset that the court is not supposed to be accountable to these other institutions. And, that gives me great pause, Ken, for two reasons. One, accountability is actually pretty central to the court's legitimacy, right? Like having a court that is actually not beholden to, but at least in conversation with the political branches has historically been a big part of why we've given the court so much power and we've allowed the justices to have so much sway over so many issues in our lives. But two, what do we do when it's gone? Right? The Supreme Court has no hard power. Its power is all soft power. And, I'm, even as a progressive, right, I really worry about a universe in which the court has no legitimacy in the eyes of half the country, because I don't know how a court that depends upon public support to get its decisions enforced can expect to have unpopular decisions enforced when half the country doesn't think the court's legitimate in the first place. So that to me is why it's so important, right, for the court as much as anybody else to be invested in avoiding this continuing erosion of public support and public confidence.
Yeah, and what about the ethical lapses of some of the justices? Is that further contributed to the loss of legitimacy, loss of trust by the public?
I mean, I'm sure it has, and Ken, I think it's both a symptom and a cause, right? I mean, so I think the ethical lapses, and we might debate which ones are lapses and which ones are not, but the lapses that are out there, I think, are symptoms of this lack of accountability that we've been talking about, right? And of the extent to which the court really doesn't believe it is beholden to anybody else at this moment in time. And it's a contributing factor to why I think there's so much mistrust and distrust, right, of the court. And I guess, part of why I wrote the book is because it is so common for folks to assess the court and to measure the court based upon whether we agree with or disagree with the bottom lines the justices are reaching. The court's good when I like what it's doing, and it's bad when I don't like what it's doing. And I'm really trying to sort of shake us out of that mindset a little bit, because I think that mindset really does sort of put us into this infinite feedback loop where every time the court does something that, looks ideological, everyone goes into their camps, right? The same folks go to the same sides. When at least, Ken, some of what the Supreme Court is doing that I think is problematic isn't ideological at all. It's just institutional. And we ought to get back in the habit of talking about the court as an institution, at least in part because I think that's also how we get meaningful progress toward reform, is by persuading those who actually may like what the court's doing on the bottom lines of these cases, that it's in their interest too for the court to be a healthier, more legitimate, more cooperative institution in our system of governance than it has been in recent years.
So again, you've sort of answered the question, but why do you think we need a legitimate Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is because without a legitimate Supreme Court, I mean, there are democracies out there that are perfectly high functioning democracies that don't have a strong Supreme Court. I think you could design a system to have a pretty high functioning democracy without a powerful Supreme Court, but that's not our system. And in our system, we depend, for better or worse, on the Supreme Court to protect us against tyrannies of the majority. And in a world in which the Supreme Court has, very little, if not no legitimacy, really hard for it to play that function because no one's going to carry out its mandates. You're not going to have President Eisenhower sending the army into Little Rock to enforce Brown, right? You're not going to have President Bush after the Guantanamo cases saying, I don't agree with the court, but I respect the decision and I'll follow it. Right? If all of a sudden it became politically popular for, political figures to disregard the court, that is a really, really bad place to be in, because if it's not going to be the court who pushes back against those political figures, who's left? And that, that to me is a even worse sort of end game than a very conservative court that is nevertheless legitimately, right, handing down decisions I disagree with.
So do you have any suggestions of how to reform this? How to stop this reliance on the secret docket?
So, I think there's a lot the Congress can do. There's a lot the court can do. Ken, some of it the court has done already. We have seen in the last year some shifts in the court's behavior through, in these emergency applications. We're seeing fewer and fewer that are splitting the court right down ideological lines. We're seeing more of an effort for the court to provide explanations, at least sometimes. Ken, we've seen the court take emergency applications and kick them over to the merits docket if the issues were really nationally important, like President Biden's student loan program. So I think in some respect, these critiques are already landing and have already provoked at least some modest but salutary changes in the court's behavior. There are specific things I'd like to see the court do vis-a-vis the shadow docket in particular. But Ken, the broader point, I think, is the more important one, that the real reform that's missing is any reform at all. For most of American history, Congress helped to keep the court in check by regularly pulling the different levers Congress had to pull about where the court sat, when it met, how many justices there are, the budget, the docket. Congress exerted and exercised all kinds of control over the court's work, and not to minimize the court, not to destroy the court, but to keep the court sort of on par with, right, the other institutions in our government. And really, for the better part of 35 years now, Congress has taken its hands off. And so to me, there are lots of specific reforms that I'd love to talk about and see Congress adapt. But shoot, anything at this point, just reminding Congress that it has the power and the responsibility to regulate the court would be a really good start. And, even for folks who say, you expect this Congress to do anything? Actually, I do. The one thing I'm pretty confident this Congress is going to do is fund the court. The Supreme Court's budget request for fiscal year 2024 is $151 million. Congress is not constitutionally required to pass any of that except for the $3 million that is the justices' salaries. That leaves $148 million of leverage. And so, to me, Ken, the story is not about any particular magic bullet as reforms go, right? But rather about, getting us, all of us, to talk about the court in the kinds of institutionalist terms that might help to reinvigorate meaningful separation of powers pushback across any number of fronts. Not because conservatives bad, liberals good, but because institutions in our government are supposed to be checking each other.
So, Steve, we have quite a few questions from the audience. Let me see what we've got here. From Michael Kessler, let me read. It says, you speak about emergencies as being a basis for jumping the line, so to speak, to get in front of the court. But what's the definition of an emergency? It's easy to decide an emergency in a death penalty case if the defendant will be executed tonight or tomorrow, although why lawyers waited until the last hour can be criticized. It may be easy to decide President Trump's Muslim ban was an emergency. But what about other cases in which the lawyers claim emergency?
So the rules are supposed to account for Michael's question, because one of the prerequisites, one of the criteria for getting emergency relief is that you, the party seeking it, have to show irreparable harm. You have to show not just that the lower court decision you're trying to undo is hurting you, but that that harm that you're suffering is not capable of being remedied later, right? That just having that decision get reversed 6 months or a year from now is not going to be adequate. And Ken, I think, this is getting a bit into the legal technicalities, but I think one of the ways in which the Supreme Court has, made emergency relief so much more prevalent and so much more common is by watering down what irreparable harm is. So, for example, in the context of the religious liberty cases during the COVID pandemic, the court publicly expressed the view that even a temporary infringement of religious liberty is irreparable harm, right? And which was a necessary step towards saying, therefore, we can take these extraordinary steps to block these, California and New York COVID mitigation policies. So I think there's no question that the court is itself responsible for watering down the way that emergencies used to be factored into the analysis. That's fixable, I think, right? The issue is sort of pushing folks to understand why it's important that we not just treat everything as an emergency. And I think the question gets at that pretty nicely.
Let's see. Giannis asks, I want to ask about Roe versus Wade and the selective right of some persons to terminate the life of another person, since the only scientifically acceptable consensus is that all human beings come alive at conception. I don't know.
I'm not sure that's
into
true.
that.
I mean, I'll just say two things. One, I don't think that is the only scientifically acceptable consensus, but two, so at the end of the question, shouldn't abortions be considered unconstitutional, period? I will just say that there are plenty of examples. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the death penalty. State-sponsored death, for better or for worse, is not per se unconstitutional. And that's accepting the premise that abortions are killing people, which no court has ever accepted.
Bernie Belkin says, today, the court is perhaps the most polarized it's ever been. Why is it that we don't hear dissent from some of the justices on the Shadow Docket norms? Who determines the norms? Do they vote on the norms? Is it the Chief Justice? Why do those in the minority stay silent?
So, I mean, we actually have. I mean, I think, those dissents don't get as much attention as the big rousing dissents that we get in the merits cases. I mentioned Justice Kagan's dissent in the Texas abortion case from September 2021, where she specifically criticizes the majority's abuse of what she describes as shadow docket decision-making. Her dissent in the Alabama redistricting case in 2022 struck a very similar theme and expressed a very similar criticism. Chief Justice Roberts, who is not usually one to criticize his colleagues on the court, actually joined in one of Justice Kagan's shadow docket dissents in April 2022 in a case about a Trump-era clean water rule, where Kagan's dissent was very critical of the procedural shortcuts that the majority was taking. And this time, the chief actually joined that dissent in full. So, I think that there actually is some pretty loud, by the court's standard anyway, pushback in dissents. And I'll just say one more thing. These are not just norms. I mean, the criteria for granting emergency relief, the rules for granting a stay pending appeal are fixed by statute. And so when the Supreme Court is granting emergency relief in contexts in which the statute is not satisfied, it's not just breaking a norm, it is arguably exceeding its statutory power to act at all, which is one of the criticisms that has been leveled against the majority by Justice Kagan in the Texas abortion case, the Alabama redistricting case, the clean water case, the OSHA vaccination case. So I think this is out there. I think it's just not getting as much public attention as perhaps it ought to.
Barbara Marwell asks, since the shadow docket has been given more publicity, has there been a decrease in the use of the shadow docket?
So yes and no, Barbara. The short version is there was last term, right? So October from October 2022 to October 2023, there was a pretty sharp decline in how many times the Supreme Court granted emergency relief. There were only, I think, 8 or 9 last year versus 24 the year before, 22 the year before that. And that's a meaningful number. The overall number of requests hasn't really changed much at all. If anything, it's ticked up a bit because I think lawyers are seeing more and more reason to at least try in these cases. And at least, Barbara, so far this term, the court's off to a pretty quick start. It's already granted 2 emergency applications in the first 3 weeks of the term. There are other big ones pending right now. So I'm not sure we can say that there's been a real, other than maybe if last term might have been an aberration. I think the larger point is that the justices do seem to be a little more conscious of avoiding what to me were the worst intersecting problems of the shadow docket, which was, splitting right down the middle in big cases with massive impacts and no explanations. And I think the short version of that is we're seeing less and less of that. And that's as much, I think, a function of changing behavior by 2 justices in particular, by Justices Kavanaugh and Barrett, as it is anything broader.
Carolyn asked the question, according to CBS News, Justice Amy Coney Barrett says she favors having the Supreme Court adopt ethics rules. What motivates her to favor this, in your opinion, and how likely is it that they will adopt such rules, and who will write the rules?
I think it's really striking. So Justice Barrett said this in public remarks at the University of Minnesota on Monday. It wasn't an accident, right? I mean, I think, right, Ken, I think she chose that moment to make that comment. And I think that's telling because, to me, that's her way of signaling that she's interested in ethics reform, that she thinks there ought to be a code of ethics, that the court ought to be committed to it. What's the issue, I think, is less, Ken, whether there will be rules than who will enforce them and how. Right? And, that's a trickier question. And I think that question really is about what can Congress do, right? Because you can have all the rules in the world. If there's no way to enforce those rules don't mean much. So, I have a newsletter, as you mentioned at the top, about the Supreme Court, and I wrote this week about the possibility of Congress creating a so-called Article 3 Inspector General, basically someone who the court would appoint, but who would have sort of the job of monitoring compliance with whatever rules, right, the justices choose to adopt. And Ken, that officer would not be in a position to really punish the justices for misbehavior, but he or she could document that misbehavior, both for the public and for Congress, because everyone agrees at the end of the day, the ultimate remedy Congress has to punish misbehaving justices is the impeachment power. And so I think the key is to have a sort of a neutral arbiter who's not imposing judgment, but who at least can sort of monitor compliance and non-compliance, so that instead of having to fight over, well, ProPublica says X and the Wall Street Journal says Y, right, Congress can say the court's own inspector general says Justice, Smith did this bad thing. That to me is a much more, I think, coherent and, politically moderate, right, way forward. And it gets back to the larger point, which is, to me, any conversation about court reform, really, to have any chance of going anywhere, has to be about institutional reform and not just, progressives punishing conservatives or vice versa.
Colette asks, you speak of the shadow docket from the point of view of the court. Please look at how the Federalist Society and other conservative forces have deliberately pushed for the shadow docket.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that a fair amount of the litigation behavior, and the book talks about this, that have brought a bunch of these cases to the Supreme Court has been, at least to some degree, coordinated and organized Again, though, I mean, right, the cases are only as good as the judges who hear them. And so, I don't know that we're ever going to change who the interest groups are in this country, so much as we should be focusing on making it in the court's interest, making the justices more invested in issuing decisions that are not just going to satisfy particular interest groups and particular constituencies, but they're going to reinforce public confidence. Not that the court's doing what we want it to do, right? We're not going to agree with the court a lot of the time, but at least that the court is acting like a court. And that, to me, is the real mantra that we ought to be pushing, that the book tries to suggest. And that I think, when we think about what makes the current moment and the current court different from prior ones, that, Ken, to me, is the real nub of the matter, much more than the court's composition, is that this is a court that, for various reasons, is unbeholden to and believes itself unbeholden to any other institution of American government. And whether you like what that means in the short term or not, that has lots of ominous long-term implications for our legal system and for the rule of law.
Let me ask you, the role of the Chief Justice, John Roberts. I mean, lately he has been critical of the shadow docket, right? The shortcuts. But yep. Is he a key to the problem and a key to the solution?
The Chief Justice, it's a fascinating question. And I mean, Ken, as you know, the conclusion of the book dwells on the Chief Justice a little bit. I think the Chief is very much committed to his particular idiosyncratic conception of what institutionalism means. So when he thinks that the other justices, on the right are taking bad procedural shortcuts that are making the court look bad, he's perfectly happy to call them out. And we've talked about some of the opinions where he did that. But when it comes to the sort of the separation of powers dynamic more broadly, he's very resistant, right, to, testifying before Congress, to letting the FBI come and participate in the leak investigation, to anything, right, that would sort of open the door, set a precedent for any sort of outside interference in the workings of the court. And Ken, to me, I understand where both of those institutionalist instincts are coming from. I agree with one of them and I disagree with the other. Right, that I think, having a meaningful interbranch dialogue actually is good for the court in the long term, even if, in the short term, you're wary of it because of the politics of this particular moment.
Steve, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much. Now that we have a better idea about the secret docket and its consequences, maybe we share your alarm, and we all hope that the changes soon will be made. Our next Friday at 1 event will take place on Friday, November 10th, when journalist and best-selling author Jeff Goodell will talk about his new book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Another serious subject. Thank you all for coming. We hope to see you all on November 10th. And thank you so much again, Steve.
Ken, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to everyone at CUNY for all that went into this. And thank you guys all for taking the time to watch us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.